Emmett Castellano Reyes had been putting off tearing down his great-uncle's old smokehouse for 3 winters, mostly out of a vague, unexamined reluctance to touch anything that had belonged to the old man, and finally did it on a cold Saturday in November for the least sentimental reason imaginable. He needed firewood. The structure was falling apart anyway, and the seasoned oak boards it was built from would burn better than anything he could buy that winter. "You're burning history for kindling," said his neighbor, Roscoe Villanueva, watching Emmett pry the first boards loose from the smokehouse's north wall. "Old Baptiste built that thing by hand sometime before either of our fathers were born. Seems a shame to just feed it into a stove." "It's falling down on its own either way," Emmett said. "I'd rather get some use out of it before it collapses and I lose the wood to rot instead." The smokehouse had sat mostly unused for the better part of 2 decades, since his great-uncle Baptiste's death, a squat, windowless structure of hand-hewn oak and fieldstone tucked into the back corner of the property where generations of the family had once cured hams and sausages through the coldest months of the year. Emmett had always found the building faintly unsettling in the vague way old outbuildings from a childhood he only half remembered tend to feel. Dark and low-ceilinged and smelling permanently of old smoke no matter how many years had passed since a fire had actually burned inside it. He worked through the outer walls that first Saturday without finding anything more interesting than the expected accumulation of decades. Old nails, a few rusted hooks that had once held curing meat, a scattering of dry rot in the boards closest to the ground. It was on the second weekend, once he'd cleared enough of the interior framing to start on the smokehouse's rear wall, that his crowbar caught on something that didn't behave like the rest of the structure, a section of the fieldstone foundation that gave slightly under pressure in a way solid stone masonry never should have. "That's not stone," Emmett said out loud, to nobody, kneeling in the cold to get a better look at what turned out to be a carefully fitted wooden panel, built to mimic the surrounding fieldstone closely enough that it had fooled him, and presumably everyone else, for as long as the smokehouse had stood. Behind the panel, once he worked it loose, was a narrow door, genuinely old, hand-built from the same oak as the rest of the structure, set into a short earthen passage that ran a little more than 6 feet before opening into a small, low-ceilinged room dug into the hillside behind the smokehouse, dry and cool and completely undisturbed as far as Emmett could tell in the weak light of his phone's flashlight. He called Roscoe before he did anything else, mostly because he didn't trust his own judgment about whether what he was looking at was actually significant or just an old man's forgotten root cellar, and Roscoe, arriving within the hour with an actual work light, confirmed that it was, at minimum, considerably more deliberate than a simple storage afterthought. "Baptiste built a hidden room behind his smokehouse," Roscoe said, running the light slowly across walls lined, Emmett now saw clearly, with a neat row of shelving built directly into the packed earth, and disguised the door well enough that nobody ever found it. "That's not an accident. That's a man who wanted somewhere private." What they found on those shelves, over the following several visits with better lighting and considerably more care than that first cold flashlight survey, was less a treasure in any dramatic sense, and more a genuinely startling record of exactly the kind of man Baptiste apparently hadn't let most of the family see while he was alive. Dozens of carefully labeled jars of preserved food, decades old and long past any usable state, evidence of an obsessive, methodical food preservation practice far beyond what a normal smokehouse operation would require. A small collection of hand tools, some of them clearly homemade, suited to work considerably more precise than the rough farm carpentry Baptiste had been known for, and, tucked into a battered tin box at the back of the lowest shelf, a stack of notebooks filled with the old man's own cramped, careful handwriting. Emmett spent that whole winter reading through them, slowly, in the evenings, and what he found was not a diary in any conventional sense, but something closer to a decades-long research journal, recording experiment after experiment in food preservation technique, smoking times, salt ratios, humidity control achieved through the hillside room's natural coolness, methods for extending shelf life that Baptiste had apparently worked out through years of patient trial and error, largely alone, in a hidden room nobody in the family had ever known existed. He never told anybody about any of this, Emmett said to Roscoe that January, the two of them going through the notebooks together at Emmett's kitchen table. 50 years of research, and nobody in the family ever saw a page of it. Baptiste wasn't much for showing his work, Roscoe said. I remember him being a private man. I didn't know he was this private. What made the notebooks more than a curious family artifact? Once Emmett started sharing photographs of a few pages with a food historian he found through a regional preservation society, was how far ahead of documented regional practice some of Baptiste's methods appeared to run. A handful of the specific preservation techniques recorded in the notebooks, particular combinations of smoke exposure and controlled humidity that Baptiste had clearly refined through years of iteration, matched almost nothing in the historian's own reference material for that specific region and era, suggesting the old man had either independently developed methods considerably more sophisticated than his neighbors, or had learned them from some source nobody in the family had ever mentioned or perhaps even known about. This is exactly the kind of thing regional food historians spend careers hoping to find and almost never do. The historian, a careful, soft-spoken woman named Dr. Odalise Ferreira, told Emmett after her first full read-through of copies he'd made of the most detailed notebooks. Most traditional preservation knowledge like this was never written down at all, just passed hand to hand and lost within a generation or two, once nobody bothered to ask the right questions before the person who knew it died. Your great-uncle apparently wrote his down anyway, for reasons that might have had nothing to do with anyone else ever reading it. Dr. Ferreira eventually helped Emmett get a portion of Baptiste's notebooks properly documented and preserved through the Regional Historical Society, and a handful of the specific techniques recorded there ended up incorporated into a small exhibit on regional food preservation history the following year, credited, at Emmett's insistence, to a man who had spent 50 years perfecting a body of knowledge in near total secrecy behind a false stone wall nobody had thought to question. Emmett finished tearing down the smokehouse itself that following spring, once the hidden room had been properly documented and its contents carefully removed, and burned the old boards exactly as he'd originally planned, though he kept the hidden door itself, unable in the end to feed the one piece of the whole structure that had actually mattered into his own stove. Everybody thought I was tearing down an old building for firewood, Emmett said, standing in his kitchen with Baptiste's notebooks stacked neatly on a shelf he'd built specifically for them. I just didn't know I was also about to find out that the man who built it had spent half his life doing something nobody else in this family ever gave him credit for.